Welcome to the third session of the Launchpad. My name is Emmanuelle Maitre. I'm a research fellow at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris. I'm delighted to be hosting this third episode, especially since the first two have really been a great success. For those who are joining us today for the first time, so this series was created by Unidio to make sure that despite the very peculiar circumstances of the spring 2020, we would still have a forum to discuss space security issues. And it's been really a very good idea because the large attendance of the first two webinars has proved that there was indeed a demand for such an event. I would like to congratulate and thank Unity already at this stage for setting up this very topical series in such a compressed time, as well as, of course, the Secure World Foundation. We are delighted at the Foundation FRS to be working again together this year on these topics. We would also like to thank the European Union, the Swiss government for their support, as well as the governments of New Zealand, Russia, and Sweden. Before we go on, just a couple of logistical points for this event, especially once more for those who are joining us for the first time. So today's meeting is going to be in English only. It will be recorded and available in a couple of days on the Unidio website. For the good functioning of the event, of course, it's best if everybody keep their microphone muted and camera off when they're not using them. For the audience, as you may have seen already, you have a Q&A box on the right of your screen where you can, as for now, ask questions to our panelists. You also have a multimedia viewer that you can use, and I would encourage you to do it because as much as you might want to hear from us, we want to hear from you. And so there is already a question on the screen that you are, of course, welcome to answer. We will submit more questions during the duration of this session. If your multimedia viewer or Q&A boxes are not open yet, you can do it by clicking below the video. You should have three dots that you can click on, and then click on the little blue box that says Q&A or multimedia viewer. A couple of other general points. Unidio will be sending out a link for you to give feedback on this event, so do not hesitate to submit also feedback. These kind of webinars, these kind of events are still quite new, so of course the more we hear about the viewers, the best it is to improve the way they are rated. Now, if we go into our subject, our meeting today is called Rockets, Missiles, and Space, Lessons from the Hague Code of Conduct and Beyond. And I'm sure that we are going to go much beyond and explore a range of topics today. But before we start the discussion, I would like to note that for the two previous years, FRS and Unidir have worked together during these spring meetings on space security on the connections, on the links between launching technologies, and especially space launch vehicles and ballistic missiles. And as we have done that, we have explored the role of the Hague Code of Conduct against the proliferation of ballistic missiles. For those who do not know well this instrument, so it was adopted in 2002, and it is an interesting instrument as it is the only one that calls for the same transparency measures for space launch vehicles and for ballistic missiles. So it really thinks about the proximity of both activities, civilian activities, and military activities. So it's especially interesting to compare the development of both vectors and to understand to what extent confidence building measures such as this code of conduct can promote the peaceful use of space and address the questions of dual use technologies. And to finish this long introduction, I would like to note that today is a special day for the Hague Code of Conduct because today Norway is handing over the rotating chairmanship of the code to Switzerland. It has been a very successful chairmanship for Norway. We have had 3 new subscribing states in early 2020. So now there are 143 subscribing states. So it's a great and exciting challenge for Switzerland to take up the chairmanship today. Now I am going to start the panel with a pre-recorded presentation by Paul Meyer. Paul Meyer is a fellow in international security and adjunct professor of international studies at Simon Fraser University, and he's a former career diplomat from Canada. Paul Meyer is going to present ideas from an upcoming paper for UNIVIR on the interrelations between offensive missiles, missile defense, and outer space weaponization. And he will conclude with proposition to reduce the risks in this realm. Once again, it's a pre-recorded presentation, so unfortunately, it won't be possible to ask questions directly to Paul, but we will then have responses by two distinguished experts. So I'm sure it's going to be a very lively conversation on these points.
Well, first, greetings to all of those participating in today's event. I'm sorry I can't join, but I would say that when John and Daniel first approached me about the idea of a paper on the interrelationship between ballistic missile defense and outer space, I really was quite intrigued as these are two salient themes for the narrative on international security since the Second World War, and particularly the interface between the terrestrial and space realms. Now, from the advent of the space age with the launch of Sputnik in 1957, this has really been a story with two conflicting elements. Now, on one hand, there is the space as the new environment for effecting impressive cooperation between the superpowers. This is the domain of the Outer Space Treaty, with its commitment for using space for peaceful purposes, with its prohibition on weapons of mass destruction in orbit, the militarization of celestial bodies, with its quite strong affirmation and indeed celebration of scientific and exploratory cooperation for the benefit of all countries in this unique province of all mankind in the terms of the treaty. And of course, that cooperation has continued over the decades and most notably embodied in the International Space Station. And yet, on the other hand, and simultaneously to this first narration, if you wish, there's also been a constant effort to exploit space for military gain. And we've had the efforts, be it initially in nuclear explosive tests in orbit, to the development and testing of anti-satellite weapons, to plans for more exotic outer space weaponry, like space-based ballistic missile defense. So all of these have characterized a relentless effort to exploit space for strategic gain. At the same time, the risks of certain military activity in space leading to major adverse consequences for all users has, be it from electromagnetic pulses generated by nuclear explosions to physical debris as a result of destructive anti-satellite weapon tests, all have instilled a certain restraint in the military actions of spacefaring states. Now, for decades, the common ground between the rival superpowers has been strategic stability, understood as both sustaining a mutual vulnerability to nuclear attack, but also to preclude incentives for any first strike. All this via cooperative arms control. The common understanding and commitment to strategic stability is now in doubt, however, and recent developments, be they in ballistic missile defense, counter space capabilities, and the dismantlement of existing arms control agreements have raised serious concerns for the future. Beyond the current great power confrontations, There is a strong consensus, however, on the part of the international community in favor of reinforcing, not demolishing, the existing legal regime for the prevention of an arms race in outer space and its weaponization. This strong sentiment finds expression in the annual PEROS, Prevention of Arms Race in Outer Space resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly with near universal support. For me, a key question has been why greater diplomatic efforts have not been made to transform the clear PEROS resolution call for, quote, additional measures into purposeful action. Now, my paper briefly recounts the fate of a handful of initiatives that were aiming to do just this, none of which, alas, have been brought to fruition. Part of the reason for this is what I term the devil's triangle of offensive nuclear missiles, ballistic missile defense, and outer space weaponization, and their acute interrelationships and the potential for destabilizing that strategic balance, all of which makes achieving progress in terms of arms control on any single element extremely difficult. Particularly, any deployment of space-based ballistic missile defense represents the crossing of a critical red line in this regard. Still, even in these challenging circumstances, I see the possibility for creative diplomacy to achieve progress. And I suggest in the paper 3 initiatives to this end, which I believe are both feasible and could be undertaken in the near term. First would be to conclude a protocol to the Outer Space Treaty. This would give legal expression to the refrain from the Paris Resolution to stop the weaponization of outer space by extending the current prohibition on WMD to all forms of weaponry. It would also have the advantage of not requiring the opening up of the Outer Space Treaty itself. The second idea would be a resumption of negotiations on the draft International Code of Conduct, this time under UN auspices. I think there were many positive aspects of the EU original, which could be salvaged and indeed possibly enhanced through such a process. I was particularly taken by the innovative ideas for providing institutional support and ongoing monitoring of the norms contained in that International Code of Conduct. And the third idea is a negotiation on a ban on destructive anti-satellite tests. This is a perennial candidate for space arms control, but I think there is growing appeal. It has growing appeal due to the recent proliferation of anti-satellite tests, and that it would also afford some opportunity of trying to preclude such tests extending into high orbits. So those are my top candidates for advancing space security through diplomacy, but they would need concerned states and other stakeholders, and we're very conscious with Saturday's accomplishment by SpaceX, how the private sector's involvement in space affairs is growing by leaps and bounds. We need some champions for these ideas, for them to really see the light of day and advance in a purposeful manner. I do hope sincerely that some champions will come forward before too long. I thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.
Excellent. I think it is now time to go a little bit deeper into this devil's triangle that Paul Meyer was alluding to just now, and to talk a little bit about these connections between offensive capabilities missile defense capacities and space weaponization. To do that, we are going to turn right now to our first respondent, Dmitry Stefanovich, who is going to comment on what we just heard, of course, but also maybe insist a little bit more about offensive capabilities and especially the risk they pose in terms of access to a secured space. Knowing that our audience has also been asked in the beginning of the session whether having a rocket amounted to having missile capabilities. So that's exactly this kind of connection that Dmitry is going to address. Dmitry Stefanovich is a research fellow with the Center for International Security of IMEMO in Moscow, but also a non-resident fellow at the IFSH in Hamburg, researching especially on new technologies, strategic stability, and global security. Dmitry, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to join you here. Okay, and what shall I add to what? It's hard to add anything to what had been said. So all the painful points had been pushed. I'd start with saying just a few words about HCOC, the Hague Code of Conduct. We must clearly understand what it does and what it does not. It is huge. It covers a lot of countries, but it doesn't provide any limits. It just asks for transparency and for responsible behavior in terms of missile technologies. Still, it is extremely important, and there is room to enhance this stuff. Of course, if we launch stuff in space, long-range ballistic missiles or space launch vehicles, they will be detected one way or other by national technical means or some other way. But at the same time, if we provide information about this, if this or that country provides information in advance, provides information after some period of time, it shows that it cares. It cares about what is being done by different countries, and it shares what it cares what other countries think about it. So about links between space launch vehicles and ballistic missiles. Back in the day, probably many of you know, actually the first ICBM was also the first space launch vehicle that launched the payloads into space, the R-7, the Sputnik, all these nice things. And since then, after this, many Russian Soviet design bureaus were keen to have a universal missile, universal rocket that can be used for both. There were all series of so-called universal rockets, UR-100 and so on, that received different designators in NATO and the US. If you're interested, you search for SS-10, SS-17, all the way to SS-19. And the idea was to use the same boosters both to launch things into space and to be able to deliver their warheads to the adversary. However, in the end, there was a clear understanding that it's complicated to have both of the best of the both worlds, because the ICBMs, the offensive missiles, they need protected better. They need to have complicated fueling technologies to keep it ready for start and so on. And of course, their weapons, their silos, their launch positions have to be protected. It's not the same for the space launch vehicles, obviously. Still, when in the end, all Soviet ICBMs were used for space launches. There was different projects, almost all of those, to deliver payloads to space, but it seems that it is not the perfect option anyway. What I have to underline here is that some of these projects, especially run by Chalomey, the famous designer, actually linked the space infrastructure and the land-based strike systems, the monitoring, and so on. So the idea was to have a single launch vehicle for the things you need to be in space to give targeting to the weapons you'll launch from the Earth. It didn't work actually as intended, But there is one very interesting example that is currently all over the news. You've heard probably about the Avangard missile system with hypersonic glide vehicle or wing gliding battle payload, as we say in Russian. And it is precisely linked to a number of technologies researched of space flight, of so-called rocket planes, and actually the Strela space launch vehicle based on the same SS-19 ICBM booster. So the connection is still there. And what is most important in that regard is the reason to invest in such expensive technologies, not for any civilian purpose, but to deliver a nuclear warhead to intercontinental distances, is the development of missile defenses, including those based in space. So here is an explicit link. If we go to other countries like Iran or North Korea, many people often argue that as long as they develop space launch vehicles, they also have the capability for long-range strike missiles. It is not that simple, to put it mildly. As I've said earlier, it is hard to have a survivable nuclear or just a conventional deterrent if you have your huge space launch vehicle sitting on a launch pad. It is you need different dimensions, you need different operations, all this stuff. But at the same time, you can test different stages, you can test different fuels, you can test targeting, and in the end, you need a space launch capability to ensure that your strike missile capability will have required targeting, required information. And that's why, back to HCOC, it's great that this regime, if I might call it a regime, uses both. It covers both the space rockets and ballistic missiles. It would be great if it was more universal. I personally, as an expert, I'd love to see the reports being delivered by different countries. I understand that there are different interests with that regard. And my last point, it would be also a great idea to invest in some international early warning capability, just based on land-based radars or satellites operated by some joint team, and gathering data available for everyone on space launch and the launch of ballistic missiles. I think it is possible because even countries who are not currently within the HCOC, for example, China, has different processes that provides for sharing of such information. For example, Russia and China has a standing treaty on exchange of notifications on space launches and ballistic missile launches. And with that, I'll probably stop. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. Thank you for allowing us to go a step further, I would say, in understanding the ways we can think about those dual-use technologies, the potential links between rockets, launchers, but also the interests of trying to cover both into confidence-building measures. I would like now to turn to Laura Grego. Laura Grego is a senior scientist in the Union of Concerned Scientists Global Security Program. She's an expert on space security issues as well as ballistic missile defense. And I think Laura is going to bounce back on the points that were made also by Paul Meyer, specifically on missile defense, the commonalities maybe between interceptors and anti-satellite weapons, but also the risks of space-based missile defense interceptors. And as you comment, I would like to announce the next question we are going to ask to our audience, which is precisely going to address this topic and to be when you have missile defense capabilities, do you also have anti-satellite capabilities? So that's going to be the next question. I think, Laura, your presentation is going to provide us insights on this aspect as well.
Hi, good morning. You can hear me? Great, thanks. I know things are very difficult for many of us right now, so I hope that this finds you all safe and healthy and thriving. Could I have the first slide, please? Yeah, so as Emmanuelle mentioned, I'm going to be diving into two vertices of what Paul called the Devil's Triangle, the ballistic missile defenses and anti-satellite weapons. They have a long history of close association. During the years that the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was in effect, states might have preferred to describe missile defense technology developments as anti-satellite weapons research because the former was heavily restricted by treaty. Today, missile defenses are not formally restricted by treaty, and states are increasingly uneasy about anti-satellite weapons. So many of the technologies are relevant to both missions, and I think it will be hard to find solutions without considering both at the same time, and perhaps, as Paul mentioned, all three in the Devil's Triangle. By this discussion, I do want to convey that not all ballistic missile defenses have inherent anti-satellite capability. This is a cartoon Venn diagram, but as a way to convey that, you know, theater and regional systems have much less, strategic systems have much more, and these capabilities actually could be clearly distinguishable technically, should we decide, again, that limits are in our interests. And the converse is not true. There is a wide range of technologies that hold satellites at risk that have no uses against ballistic missiles. Could I have the next slide, please? The close association is because long-range ballistic missiles travel at speeds and altitudes comparable of those of low Earth orbiting satellites. What you see here is a light blue circle is a circular low Earth orbit at 1,000 kilometers altitude. And in yellow is a ballistic missile launch trajectory of around 11,000 kilometers range. Its highest point, it reaches around 1,250 kilometers. Both of these are traveling at a bit over 7 kilometers a second, about 30 times the speed of a jet plane. So in fact, while technologies being developed for long-range ballistic missile defenses might not prove very effective against missiles for many reasons, which I won't discuss here for the moment, they could be far more effective against satellites. And there are a few reasons for this. One is that the launch of a ballistic missile may occur with little or no notice. It takes 30 to 40 minutes from launch to landing. However, satellites travel in repeated predictable orbits, and observations of the satellite can be used to predict its future position. So an anti-satellite attack could be planned in advance, has less restrictive sensor requirements, could be conducted under the most convenient conditions, and the attacker can try multiple times if the first try fails. While an adversary launching a ballistic missile might take advantage of the short duration of the flight to introduce decoys or other countermeasures, those are less effective in a satellite frame. So the systems that I'm going to talk about, I just have a few minutes here, are kinetic energy interceptors, which basically are a projectile that destroys its target by the force of impact. You could imagine that could be used both against a boosting missile body, or the warhead itself in the mid-course phase, or against a satellite. So of these kinetic energy systems, so there's also ideas for missile defenses that include directed energy, which generally means high-powered lasers that would compromise an object structurally by heating it up. You might note that a warhead that's meant to withstand the rigors of reentry would be more robust to that type of interference than a satellite, which is generally has more delicate parts. But of these systems, the only strategic missile defense systems that have actually been fielded are ground-based kinetic energy missile defenses and ground-based interceptors with nuclear warheads. Though there continue to be research projects on directed energy and in space-based options. And there are some plans to use regional sea-based kinetic energy missile defenses as part of the strategic system. The US has a deployed system. China and India have demonstrated examples of exoatmospheric destruction of satellites with these direct descent kinetic energy interceptors. The US was explicitly with its missile defense interceptor in the most recent test. The primary limit to whether a missile defense system can be used to target satellites is whether that interceptor can actually reach the satellites. We expect that once a kill vehicle, the actual thing that hits it, is perfected, it just needs to get to the right place and be able to be in the right place in the right time. So remember that ICBM's highest points are still in low Earth orbit. So that's generally what we're talking about. So for most of this, we're not talking about medium Earth orbits or geosynchronous. So the interceptor ranges, the ability of these is closely related to what is called the speed of the interceptor. It's a useful way to think about them because as the speed increases, so does its ability to reach vertically up to satellites or laterally to get satellites that are not passing directly overhead. This also starts to show where useful limits on ranges to missile defense interceptors might be. There are other countries besides these. Certainly, I haven't done the research yet, but I would locate the Chinese and Russia somewhere between sort of the US Aegis systems. But in any case, as soon as you get beyond sort of a theater range system, you could reach some low Earth orbit satellites. You can see at 3 kilometers a system, a system that has a burnout velocity of 3 kilometers a second, sort of on the ground, defends a few hundred kilometers region. And it could only reach the lowest satellites. But once you build a system that's meant to defend sort of thousands of kilometers, you can start to reach significantly up into low Earth orbit satellites. At higher speeds, systems such as the US ground-based mid-course defense, which is the primary strategic missile defense, has very powerful interceptors. It's meant to defend the entire country from ICBMs. Those could reach all of low Earth orbiting satellites as they pass overhead and have enough speed to reach out laterally to a large percentage of satellites that don't pass directly. So that's low Earth orbit. Beyond that, the next significant collections of satellites, of course, most of the participants here know, start in the tens of thousands of kilometers. So those generally not reachable by these ground-based systems unless they're very specifically designed that way. But space-based interceptors for missile defenses could use their orbital speed plus their onboard speed to reach up to geosynchronous. Next slide, please. Of course, just because a system could do something does not mean it will be used to do so. There are powerful incentives not to test or use these interceptors against satellites. And of course, one of these is the creation of persistent orbital debris. The collision of a satellite with even a marble-sized piece of debris, sort of in 1 to 10 centimeter bin here, would cause catastrophic damage. And it's particularly dangerous because those small pieces are difficult or impossible to track. If you see a big object coming your way, you might be able to move, but you can't avoid something you can't see. The destruction of a single 10-ton satellite, and these are common, could possibly double the amount of debris in low Earth orbit. And debris is not discriminate. It would spread out over time, as you can see from this image here, and contaminate a large region. So those who have investments and aspirations in space want to avoid creating debris. And the next, moving to the next slide, because I'm going through this very quickly, but not everyone is great at thinking in orbits and movements. Me and my organization wanted to be able to communicate the unique challenges of space-based missile defenses and why making such a system would take enormous resources and why even putting a set of test interceptors in space would be dangerous. Please forgive the dramatic music, and we are policy advocates. So this was focused in a US frame, but I think the information would be useful.
All right. Thank you very much for the very clear remarks, also for this powerful argument and video. We have received a couple of questions at this stage. For the audience, please do not hesitate to send your questions now. We have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes to answer them, so we'll try to pick as much as we can. In the meantime, as I was announcing earlier, we have a question for you. Does having missile defense capabilities mean having anti-satellite capabilities too? So here I can see already a number of people responding, and we have quite a balanced views here. In the meantime, I have noticed that our panelists have not really picked up have carefully maybe not picked up the recommendations of Paul Meyer on his diplomatic solutions to increase and to answer some of the challenges he noted. So optional protocol on the outer space treaty, international code of conduct, ban on Assad tests. I would love to have your views on those propositions and maybe also see what you would see as more realistic at this stage or more urgent also, given the risks that you have outlined. So maybe Dmitry, you want to start?
I'll start. I hope everyone hears me okay now. Yeah. I think that given the circumstances, it's quite hard to argue for any ban at all. What is possible, though, is to be more transparent about the actual missions and actual threat perception of this or that countries, just to explain why do you invest in this very technology and how this, at least in your view, does not destabilize stuff. It might be complicated. It might lead to the blame game and to finger pointing, but at least there will be some reference statements, some official position that can be discussed, not in the way that like we see that some countries developing something and we are not really sure why they're pursuing this technology, what is their intentions, and we are afraid we develop something else to overcome this problem. So my point is that it's impossible to ban anything now, and everyone will always say that their technology is stabilizing while everything being developed by other people is destabilizing. But if the countries and the governments become more clear on their intentions and on their reasons, it will make things at least easier to comprehend, easier to understand. Thanks.
Thank you. Laura, do you see any of those avenues as potential diplomatic way to limit the risks that you emphasized on Assad weapons or space-based interceptors?
Hi, thanks. Well, I definitely agree with Dmitry that these conversations at high levels should take place. I think there's a lot of mistrust and misperception, and we should make sure that that those conversations happen at high levels. And I think some of that happens when you do start to negotiate or start to seriously discuss initiatives. Whether or not you can get to the very end of that initiative, I think those discussions are very important to have. I was interested in Paul's suggestion to resume the Space Code of Conduct under the UN auspices. I know that some of the objection to the European process was that it was not, that it was more of an ad hoc process, and that the preference of some states is to do things in the UN. And although the consensus requirements there make things very difficult. But I would note that within that code of conduct, there was an agreement not to destroy satellites intentionally. So that does encompass this ban on destroying satellite weapons. So it sort of encompasses his third initiative. And at least, it does seem like a long time ago. It seems almost radical to say that we could have a ban on those destructions. But I think but countries did get pretty far in that agreement, and I think things are only more urgent right now. You see is much more investment in commercial space. So I think it would be very interesting to include in this conversation, as Paul mentioned, the civil and commercial voices who also have a lot of investment in having a stable and safe and secure space.
Thank you. That's great, because it was one of the questions we just received about how to make sure that non-state actors are also included in this conversation and not just countries and governments. Two questions we have received. One, because we're speaking about the test of ICBMs especially. So one question is, shall states also inform the COPLOs about those launches, those tests? And a question about the Hague Code of Conduct on what it does prevent actually. So here, maybe we can say at this stage that it doesn't prevent anything, any development, whether it is on missiles or on launching technologies, but it requires transparency. And so that's something we can elaborate a little bit on. Dmitry, do you want to take those?
Yep. Well, it's absolutely clear that Hague Code of Conduct does not prohibit anything. It just asks for transparency and responsibility, as you said. So it's an easy question. The question about informing on ICBM tests, it's interesting because actually when countries test ICBMs, they are generally rather transparent, but not intentionally. They provide notifications to airmen and notifications to mariners and people who have the basic understanding on how missiles fly from point A to point B can rather easily dissect this information and understand what is being tested and when. So probably it looks like an easy win for everyone if the countries who test ICBMs will not just like say that they've tested this stuff and stop it. They can be more transparent about it. Of course, I'm not sure how detailed the Chinese releases are on this topic, but the Russian and American press releases, and I think to some extent French and British, but lesser, are rather clear. Like when something is launched, it is explained like what was launched. Sometimes they even add some comments like whether it is like test of reliability or life extension process or test of new types of payload. So probably it is not that hard for the countries to agree to provide this information in some unified format to international body, and it looks like a good initiative. Thanks.
Thank you. Two questions for Laura. I think the first one is political. How does the current US administration's antipathy to arms control affect forward momentum for these discussions? So on talked, of course, about a lot about arms control, about offensive weapons these past few years, but of course the space where it was already extremely difficult to have any kind of agreement. What has been the recent decisions affecting this? And a question also, because we evoked debris and collisions, we have a question about the launch of 5G satellites proposed in great numbers in LEO. Does it increase the consequences of secondary collisions and more debris in orbit? Do you know if we have research at this stage which are highlighting this danger?
Well, to the first one, how the antipathy of the U.S. government to arms control affects the prospects. Well, of course, it's very dim. It's unlikely while this administration is still in place. If the election in November brings in a different administration, almost certainly they'll have a more favorable interest in arms control. The Obama administration, the preferred approach was not legally binding arms control negotiations. It was the European Code of Conduct. That was its preference. So I don't know if that would be the same for the next one. It might be a good place to start, starting small. I don't know how, in general, the commercial space has not played a strong role in these conversations. It is, in their interest. I don't know if generally they find it interesting to exert their pressure to encourage the government to take part in these discussions. I would love to see that. As to the debris consequences of the great increase of satellite broadband constellations, I haven't performed that research, and I'm quite sure that there's plenty of people concerned and looking at that from a debris perspective. And I think the regulatory system probably has not caught up to that and needs to be on top of that more than they have. That's actually shouldn't be controversial. It probably is. So, and I think there's, of course, also concerns from people who use, I was an astronomer by profession before, and concerns about light and radio pollution. So I think we need to catch up to all of that.
Thank you. We have another group of questions, but to launch them, I think it would be great before to get back to our audience and ask the last question we have prepared for you. The question is, what lessons from the Hague Code of Conduct can be applied to space? And here, I think there are two aspects that we can look at. The first one is the format of the code. The code is a legal, politically binding agreement. Sorry. It aims at universality, contrary to other export control regimes which had been dealing with ballistic proliferation before. There is no specific verification mechanism with the code, but at the same time, since it's been in place, we have seen that more and more states felt it was in their interest to actually provide the pre-launch notifications to give their annual declarations. And so the instrument is working in a rather satisfactory fashion. It's important also to note that there is an increasing number of states that are abiding to the code, subscribing to the code, and it's not something that we can say of so many arms control instruments these days. So on the form, this idea of a non-binding, of a politically binding instrument, is it something we could really get inspired to apply to other domains in space? And of course, the ones we could have in mind is ABM, anti-ballistic missile tests. We could think about ASAT weapons as well. Another feedback we could take on the code is the fact that it provides, it has made the choice of regulating at the same time or asking for transparency on civilian space launch vehicles and ballistic missiles. So this imbrication of the dual-use technologies in one single mechanism of transparency, that's also something that we could think as a potential model. So I see that the audience is answering the word transparency is coming up a lot, but I would like to have your views as well. And so it would answer a couple of questions we had on first this idea of notifying anti-ballistic missile systems when they are tested. That's something that could be important, and ways of bringing regulation on the placement of ABM maybe systems in outer space. Laura, you want to start?
I'm sorry, could you say that again? I was following these really interesting ideas.
Yes, of course. So the idea was, could we use this framework that we see working for the Hague Code of Conduct, the idea of notification, for other activities, ABM tests, for instance, that's one question. The placement of interceptors, and of course, those ASAT weapons or.
So voluntary transparency commitments. The idea of non-placement, of course, has been of missile defense interceptors, I think, is sort of encompassed in these initiatives that in the UN General Assembly to not be the first to place weapons in space. I actually think that would be useful and helpful. You can tell from my remarks that I don't think that they're very useful weapons. They're not useful for their stated purpose, and I think there little would be lost and a lot would be gained by just setting that option aside. So, of course, the domestic politics certainly in the United States makes these types of discussions very difficult. But it may be less difficult if it isn't just siloed into a missile defense discussion and have this broader context of space security. So that, you know, I would be hopeful that that might actually provide some openings to make that conversation happen in the next round of arms control talks, which I certainly hope start next year.
Great. Dmitry, do you have any views? And also on this question we are receiving, can we assume today that these kind of non-binding voluntary measures can be reliable? Of course, it's a political question. As I said, the Hague Code for some time it's been working quite well. It doesn't mean that if there was a serious issues about compliance, it would be easy to resolve. But can we expect states, and you mentioned it in your intro as well, the idea of voluntary transparency on what you're doing, what you're launching, can it still work in the current context?
It's actually one of the biggest current debates, at least within the Russian expert community, whether unilateral transparency actually works and actually helps something, or and same goes to politically binding commitments, because there is a school of thought, and it is shared by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to some extent, that arms control must be verifiable, must be legally binding, and these kind of things. There is all the venerable experts who actually contributed to creation of the arms control architecture over the last decades that is currently under pressure. And there is also people who think that, well, we can all just be transparent and everything will work just fine. In my opinion, it is possible to like have the best of both worlds. I think that at the current, given the current state of affairs, we can't make arms control legally binding, verifiable, can't go to any limitations and reductions from the scratch. Before we get there, we need some transparency. We need some unilateral statements. We need to build confidence. It might be just the first step, and we might say that in the end, we want disarmament, we want verification, we want reductions at least. But it's hard to discuss these reductions if we actually don't know what this or that country possesses, or which missions does it intend to apply to these or that weapons. So I think it is good to start with some unilateral stuff. It won't solve anything, but given the current state again of international relations, it will be good just to show that this or that country is responsible. Some people claim that, like we did when, for example, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty was being prepared, there was no actual data on like the stock arsenals of the Warsaw Pact, and the initial system was more or less given the virtual numbers, but still it worked for some time. But in the current age, there is the circumstances are different. There is no trust, and we can start with unilateral transparency.
Yeah, that's something we can see in the comments, the question of whether trust or transparency must come first. We also have the question of definition, which I see is popping up. Define what we are talking about, whether it is interceptors, ASAT weapons. We also have the question with ballistic missiles. It may look simple, but what we should actually notify in the framework of the Hague Code is not clear. I have two interesting comments that I am reading right now. The first one about this soft law code of conduct as one participant is noting, there are some misperceptions also about those which have prevented so far some countries from joining. And Dmitry, you mentioned China, but there are also other countries which have no missile capabilities, but were afraid that this kind of instruments would also come at the expense of the development of their civilian launch programs, for instance. So how to make sure that this kind of regulation is not seen as a way to prevent the perfectly legal development of civilian technologies when they are connected, as we said earlier, with military aspects. Another question, maybe, as we are really going into the last questions for you, both of you. Of course, technologies are moving very fast in the outer space domain. Is soft law, is politically binding codes more efficient to address this constant evolution than a legally binding treaty, which by the time it is being negotiated might be already outdated on some of the concepts it is actually targeting? And the idea of extending the scope of the code, that's something that we also hear a lot in other forums to other technologies, hypersonic missiles, for instance, cruise missiles. That's maybe another question. I don't know if we'll have the time to address them all, but maybe if you can both give some insights on those. You can start, Dmitry.
Start. Well, all very good questions, very important. I'll start with the last and probably the easiest one. With hypersonic missiles, if we speak about those which are deployed, like hypersonic glide vehicles, and probably those which will dominate the development the coming decade, it's easy. They use ballistic missiles as boosters. So in terms of to make a point that they are covered by transparency measures is easy, as long as no one asks for telemetry, because telemetry is what you don't want your adversary to know about. If we speak about the why countries like or don't like a Hague Code of Conduct, one reason is, as Emmanuelle said, they are afraid that their aspirations, peaceful aspirations, will be limited. But there is exactly the opposite thinking is also possible. Why join something that doesn't work because you don't believe in unilateral transparency, in soft law, in politically binding agreements? So I think it is quite important for the people working within Hague Code of Conduct to be more vocal, explaining what are the positive outcomes of having this instrument and what are the limits that are not there, actually. With that, I'll stop and probably let Laura add a few words. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. If you have a final word.
Sure. Well, of course, I think a legally binding treaty is out of reach right now. And I don't think it's necessarily that technology moves too quickly, that's what would make it difficult. I think, as Dmitry mentioned, you need to start with shared understandings about what you're trying to achieve. I think that isn't even at all clear. The countries that are interested in these approaches, what problem they're trying to solve and how. And there's lots of very easy ways to dismiss those efforts, which I think, which don't necessarily hold water, but I think what isn't clear is a shared goal. And I think that could easily start in these conversations about confidence building and transparency and codes of conduct, and then sharpen that and then move to the next stage. I think that's probably the most likely path.
Thank you very much. I think it is time to bring our session to a close. I would like to thank our two respondents, Dmitry Stefanovich, Laura Grego, for those excellent discussions, and of course Paul Meyer for his presentation. I believe we have been able to cover a wide range of issues, and I hope our audience has enjoyed this third session of the launching pad. I would encourage you to read Paul Meyer's paper when it will be out on the media website. It will be titled Ballistic Missile Defense and Outer Space Security, a Strategic Interdependence. So I think it should be available by the end of the month. UNIDIA will be sending evaluation forms for this session. Please feel free to send your feedback. It will be extremely useful as we move forward with this kind of events. Also, I would like to invite all of you to register for the next and last sessions of the launching pad. It will take place next Wednesday at the same time, and it will aim at rethinking powers and looking ahead at multilateral approaches. Finally, I would like to thank all the people who have worked to make this series possible at a technical level. Of course, the UNIDIA team, Daniel Porras, Letitia Zarkan, and the producing team as well from Rhys McCann. It's been excellent teamwork, and we all appreciate this effort. Thank you very much, and goodbye.